Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome indeed to today's webinar, which is part of the SFJ Awards Insights series. My name's Candice Miller, and I'm the Managing Director of SFJ Awards, and I'll be hosting this event today. The SFJ Awards Insights programme is designed really to build on the commitment we make to support the centres, the employers, and the wider contacts we have by sharing news, sharing information and sharing best practice in relation to assessment, awarding and certification and the various services we provide to support that. Today's webinar is all about plagiarism in qualifications and how the particular pressures that there are on busy professional staff when they're also learners can lead to shortcuts being taken, such as the use and passing off of others' work as a candidate's own, whether by intention or indeed by mistake, leading to what can be hugely significant consequences for that individual. Plagiarism can happen in any assessment where a learner has to present evidence that's an authentic demonstration of their own work. It is a form of cheating and it can take a variety of forms, but at its most basic, it involves using content from an existing source without properly and accurately referencing that source, so that the assessor gains the impression that the content is the learner's own work when it isn't. So in today's session, what we want to talk about is what centres need to be aware of, the steps they need to take to support professional learners, so that they avoid falling into the trap of plagiarism, as well as what steps need to be taken if plagiarism is suspected. And as well as some of the practicalities, we want to talk about how learning culture in organisations affects and can impact on the experience and the expectations of the professional as a learner. We all want learners to succeed. So the support systems that are offered to them in their busy roles and as they progress in their careers play a really important part in that success. We have a great lineup for you today on our panel. Setting the scene for us are Mike Cunningham, who is the Skills for Justice Associate, and as a much better known background, he is a former CEO of College of Policing. And we also have John Clark, who is Head of Awards and Assurance Services at SFJ Awards. And they'll both give a bit of a presentation to set the context for the subsequent discussion. And then joining us to talk from a centre perspective, we have Caroline Stanley and Kate Dennis of North Yorkshire Police, together with Don Bedell, who undertakes external quality assurance services for SFJ Awards, which brings her into contact with a wide number of centres, meaning she has a helicopter view of practice. I'll introduce each of them again very briefly before we get into the panel discussion. Now, before you think that this panel makeup implies that plagiarism is an issue just for the policing sector, or even an issue that is a particular concern within policing, let me set the record straight. We're using policing as our focus for this webinar for two reasons. Firstly, because the pressures faced by busy police officers and staff as learners are a good illustration of the issues facing all busy professionals when they take on a learning process as part of their and alongside their working roles. And the second reason we're focusing in there is because of the expertise in supporting learners and in identifying and dealing with plagiarism concerns that are shown by the forces we work with. And their expertise and their willingness to share it means that we can spend some time today on considering good practice in how to give all learners the right support to prevent plagiarism, as well as the best practice and the actions to take should it be suspected. But before we begin properly, I just want to run through some basic housekeeping so you all know how to participate and get the most out of today's event. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with how Zoom webinars run by now, but just in case, a couple of quick points for you. At any point during the webinar, you can submit your questions to today's presenters. To do so, you just type your question into the Q&A feed, which you'll find a button for at the bottom of your screen on the control panel. You'll also see the questions appearing in the Q&A panel, and then you can upvote any that resonate with you the most. As time allows, the presenters will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A session that will run at the end of the webinar, and any questions that we can't answer today we'll reply to after the webinar. You'll see me from time to time looking across to the my other screen, which is where I've got a pop out with the questions so that I can keep track of those and make sure we answer them as best we can today. The webinar is being broadcast live on YouTube, as we're aware that not everyone has easy access to Zoom. So if you are watching on YouTube, again, you can put any comments or questions you have in the chat feed there, and they will be passed over to the team on Zoom so that you can still fully participate in the webinar. We do try to make the webinars two-way where we can, and while we're still in a virtual world and not really out and about, it's not quite so simple. But as usual in these webinars, attendees speakers will be muted. So the way for you to engage with us is to add any comments for our speakers and other attendees in the chat function, which you can also access via the bottom called chat on the bottom of your screen at your control panel. And it might be good, if you're willing, just to test that out, to pop your name, your role, and where you are at the moment into the chat so we all know who else is on the webinar. And to kick things off and demonstrate the use of one of the other interactive elements we're going to be using today, I'm just going to pop up a quick poll just to see how we're all doing on this, the first day of the month. And there it is. So if you would just pop in your response. How's the day going? It's 1st of July. Where are you? Are you busy but productive, loving your job, or in need of a coffee? What's your day looking like so far? Just pop your answers in, and when we get the results, we'll share them on screen so we can see how we're all doing. We will be putting another poll up towards the end of the event, so do have a go with this one so that you then know how to engage with the second one as it crops up. Oh, there we go. Oh, so most people are busy but productive. Well, that's a good sign, isn't it? And we've got a couple of folk who want it to be the weekend yet. Well, it's Thursday, so you haven't got too long to wait. So hopefully you'll be able to hold out for a bit longer, and we'll maybe give you a good session, we hope, this morning, which will help you along towards that journey to the weekend. So at the end of this event, another thing we'll be doing is sharing all the slides. We'll be sharing a link to the website, and the website is being, the webinar rather, is being recorded. So you will be able to rewatch it and to share it with any colleagues who are not here today. So it'll be available on demand via the SFJ website for the next 6 months. So here's how it's going to run today. First up, we've got an opening address from Mike Cunningham, followed by a short presentation from John Clark of SFJ Awards. We'll then go into the panel session, where I'll be asking our expert panel to share their thoughts and experiences with you and putting your questions to them. So do please remember to pose any questions you'd like the panel to address as we go through the day into the Q&A or chat, or indeed to upvote any you already see in there. Without further ado then, it's my very great pleasure to hand the floor over to Mike. Mike Cunningham retired from his role of CEO of College of Policing just last year, following a very distinguished career within policing. I know that Mike has a deep commitment to learning and the development of the policing workforce, and I'm delighted that he's now giving some of his expertise to support us and our sister organisation, Skills for Justice, alongside his many other commitments. It's great having you with us today, Mike, and I know that you want to offer some opening remarks for our audience, putting today's webinar into the wider context faced by the professional undertaking learning as part of their continuous professional development. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Candice, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to this group of people about this really important area. As you say, my background's in policing. If you aspire to be a chief officer in policing, as many colleagues on this call will know, you have to attend a rigorous selection process, and then you go on the flagship policing course, which is called the Strategic Command course. And I have, over the years, been to many Strategic Command courses to talk about ethics in policing. And one of the exercises I used to do was to work out beforehand which forces were represented on the course, where were the delegates from. I'd then research those forces, and I would take from their websites their value statements. What are the values of that organization? I would then anonymize those value statements, and I'd put them on a screen. And I would ask the delegates on the Strategic Command course who recognized their own police force value statements. And you may or may not be surprised to know that very few people could recognise the value statements from their own organisations. And bear in mind, these are people who are aspiring to be the most senior leaders in policing, who have been through very rigorous selection processes. Why do I mention this? Because I think the question that we're dealing with now strikes at the very heart of an organisation's values. And for values to have any meaning whatsoever, they have to be real, they have to mean something in terms of behaviours, and they have to be clearly understood at all levels of the organisation. I will return to that in a moment. The learning professional is at the front and centre of this discussion. So what does this mean in practice? Well, before we get into that, I want to think about what are the causes? Why do people engage in plagiarism? It could be they engage in plagiarism because they're an inherent cheat. But you'd like to assume that selection processes kind of weed those people out, and very few people are successful at entering organisations. They may be that they get insufficient support. It may be that they run out of time. It may be that they have competing pressures. We need to understand those things if we are to deal with the question that we are discussing here today. And let me be very clear, right at the outset of this conversation, in terms of values. Honesty in policing is non-negotiable, and evidence of dishonesty leads to gross misconduct and likely dismissal. It is our responsibility to try and see how we avoid meeting that point. And I think we do that by focusing on the professional as leader. In order to do that, I think we need to absolutely understand and sign up to the imperative of continuous professional development. Why is there an imperative for CPD? Well, we know that in all businesses, certainly in policing, that the nature of demand is changing. And so too are the ways of working. If we are to stay ahead of the curve, if we are to prepare a workforce that is capable of meeting future pressures, then we have to think of our commitment to continuous professional development, to supporting professionals as learners. There is a leadership responsibility to require continuous learning, to encourage it, to enable it, to support it, and to be role models. And there is an individual responsibility to own, to take responsibility for, and to commit to your own continuous learning. But I have to say that the concept of continuous professional development in policing is very far from where it needs to be. Some of you may have heard me say this before, and I don't apologise for repeating it, but it's a story about a meeting, a social meeting I had with an old school friend who is a consultant anaesthetist. And it was some months ago now, and we met in a bar before all of the pandemic happened, so it's over a year ago. And we were talking about the requirement for continuous professional development, and I was comparing policing to medicine. So he takes out his smartphone, he goes on his Royal College of Anaesthetists app, and he shows me the CPD he's done this year. He shows me what he's got to do. He shows me feedback from patients about how he has performed. Policing is a long way away from where medicine is. And when I told him that I thought this was something that medicine has been doing for a long time, he reminded me that CPD impetus really came post Harold Shipman, when Shipman was able to do all the things he did because there was no interest in the continuous learning of medical practitioners as professionals. Does that sound familiar to those of us who have been working in or can currently work in policing? There is a cultural resistance to continuous learning in policing, that learning is seen as taking time away from the real stuff of policing. I have to say that in some places there is a leadership resistance to policing. There's an overemphasis on two things: on learning being seen as a cost rather than an investment, and an overemphasis on senior leadership development. And my contention is that senior leadership development will only be effective if we focus on the development of people at all levels. So how do we create this learning environment which supports people and avoids them falling into the trap of, or falling into the pressure to fall into the trap of plagiarism? Well, this is about creating the learning environment, and that can only be done with a commitment to CPD. And what this does, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, the learning environment supports and lessens the likelihood of plagiarism. It deals with competing demands. It deals with lack of support and lack of time risks. What it doesn't do is deal with inherent cheats. But I think if those other things are done, it exposes those who would cheat anyway. And what this requires is a commitment to CPD at all levels. Without this, anti-plagiarism options become catch-a-cheat tactics rather than supporting people to optimize their contribution at work. So what are the elements of this culture of CPD? And I'm using CPD as shorthand for an overall approach to continuing supporting people to focus on their own learning as professionals. The culture of continuous learning starts right at the beginning. Who is appointed? What expectations are set out right at the beginning of a person's time with the organisation about their responsibility to look after their own professional development? Let's be clear about these expectations and what they are and what the requirements are. We need to think about who leads and how do they lead in an organisation. How do people role model their own professional development, their own commitment to learning, their own balance between time for learning and time for operational activity? We need to think about who thrives in an organisation. One clear sign of an organisation's culture is exposed by looking at the people who do well. If people do well because they are committed to their own professional development, then it is clear to me that is something that will inculcate the culture of learning as a requirement. Very often, when I was a chief constable and I'd interview people for senior promotions and I'd talk about their own commitment to professional development, they were pretty good at answering questions and saying things like, I am committed to my professional development. I want to be a gold public order commander, a gold firearms commander. Very often, even people aspiring to the most senior roles were less clear about what they were doing to be an effective leader, an effective officer, about those other skills that are required, not just the hard technical skills required in certain specific roles in policing. Who leads the learning? There are people on this call who lead learning within many organizations, and I thank you for the work that you do. We need to ensure that we have very good people in learning who can set role models, set clear expectations, and set the requirement very clearly. But crucially, we need to create a climate of trust. When I think about the trust that we put in operational police officers, for example, and some members of police staff, we allow them to go on their own into buildings to search them and retrieve valuable property. We allow them to be on their own with vulnerable people. We allow them to be there at the most intimate moments of people's lives sometimes, including bereavement. There are heavy responsibilities of trust. We need to move that across into how people learn and put that trust in them also, recognizing that there are clear lines beyond which people must not cross. We need to allow people within that environment of trust, which goes both ways, to open up lines of communication which allow people to check in, to raise issues, to be concerned, to raise concerns, to speak openly with people, sometimes out of the line management role, who can understand what those pressures are. It is crucial to create this environment that leaders put the money where their mouth is and create the opportunities for people to spend time. Honesty is non-negotiable, but I also believe that trust is non-negotiable. And in terms of how this ultimately will thrive within organizations, the values of the organization must mean something. They must have practical implications for how people go about their work. Otherwise, this whole question of professionals as learners will fall flat on its face. I'm going to leave it at that point, and I think my 10 minutes is up, and I'm very happy to answer questions later on in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant, and a really, really clear exposition of the cultural dimension to making sure that the professional as a learner is able to succeed, and that we don't just treat plagiarism as something to come down on, but actually as something to work hard to prevent. So don't forget, folks, please, if you've got some questions for Mike that we'll pick up again later on in the session, please pop them into the question and answer slot, and we'll come back to that later. Next, what I'd like to do is to ask my colleague, John Clark, who is our Head of Awards and Assurance here at SFJ Awards, and also the responsible officer, in terms of our relationship with the qualification regulatory regime, and that's Ofqual in this particular instance. As John will share, SFJ Awards is absolutely committed to upholding the trust, as Mike mentioned himself, that individuals, employers and organisations, and indeed the wider public, can have in the qualifications that we offer, meaning that we do take plagiarism suspicions and suggestions very seriously. We do want to put the learner first. We do want to ensure that learners get the support we need. Hence, we also look to advise and support centres on how to prevent the problem rather than just deal with it as a solution when it comes along. So John, with no further ado, I'll hand over to you and ask you just to talk us through our approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candice. I'm going to be looking at some of our key themes that we tend to identify. So starting off with the first of the three themes that we have. Obviously, plagiarism is always wrong, and there's no excuse at all for it to ever happen. And it's important to be aware of some of the reasons why learners may be tempted by the shortcuts which are offered by plagiarisms. These can, taking into account the inherently stressful nature of the work within the police service, this is one of those key factors which may have a challenge on the pressure that the learner is experiencing. High stress, high stakes, threats of violence and dealing with serious crime, it can be very much at the forefront of the mind. And other aspects of the pressures that they're under in terms of promotion. An example might be moving through the promotion framework within the police, hopefully leading to a better pay, better job satisfaction. And that is another of those drivers that may lead to that increased pressure, and the generating of learner evidence can be challenging. Certainly in any environment, any learning environment can be difficult. So then being able to identify and use sensitive information which overlaps with perhaps another learner who's wishing to use the same evidence due to the nature of what that task is and how it relates to the learning outcomes and assessment criteria. So it's very important to look at what are those key pressures and be aware of them. And let's not forget that these are professional learners who have families, have home commitments, and they all need to be balanced alongside their work life and the learning that they're undertaking. So let's have a look at some of the common pitfalls. Now, some of these won't be a surprise to anybody at all, in that referencing. Typically, a common issue is the fact that a learner who commits plagiarism simply has none or has inadequately referenced their source of information, clearly being able to distinguish where that wants to come in from, or alternatively sharing their work. Now, this might be very simplistically done, but with no intent. However, letting a fellow learner read the work they've produced may result in a learner lazily borrowing that learning evidence wholesale. Copywriting chunks from obscure corners of the web. We know that the internet and the web provides a plethora of information, and so 65 lines down on the search engine, you find a piece of information and then pass it on. Level 3 and above, it's more difficult. Higher order thinking is required. Existing research needs to be synthesized and absorbed and not just regurgitated back through. So these are some of the common pitfalls. And one of the most obvious of all is deadlines. They loom quickly and rapidly, and a learner could be looking at a quick win to an easy option to avoid missing that deadline. So as an awarding organization, as a centre, what is available? What are the systems that are there to enable prevention of this coming through? So as an awarding organisation, we require centres to have policies and procedures looking at how we reduce that temptation, how we look at the shared use by learners. Learners should be signed up to the regulations and a cover sheet with the work that they're submitting to say that certificate of authenticity to say it's their work, that when they put that information through, they're submitting it in good faith, that the assessor then can look at and assess to ensure that the learner is demonstrating that level of skill or competence. As a centre, you need to provide strong advice and guidance so learners can successfully manage their studies. Having sessions on referencing and how to use synthesis and understand people's ideas, how to translate those and use those ideas correctly. And set the ground rules on what learners can and can't share. Put a group discussion session on to enable them to look at how to use assessment without giving them answers, without giving it away. What we don't want to do is make it too easy to copy, paste, share. It should be their own evidence. It should be inherently linked to what they know. And if you as an assessor think you've read something before, you probably have. So keep an open mind for that and always be on the lookout for not necessarily cheating deliberately, but it can be classed as cheating. There are a number of software providers out there that check for plagiarism, and it can be an opportunity to use something like Grammarly or Turnitin. That can be used to identify where text has been submitted before, and a decision on plagiarism can be made and the assessor judgment can be then applied. Look at the schemes of work. Do the learners have sufficient time to be able to undertake the learning, the assessment in that time period and be able to submit it within the time period? If necessary, offer extensions to learners who have a genuine case, a genuine reason as to why they need to be having that extension, and where appropriate, using the reasonable adjustments to enable learners more time, support, and additional needs, such as dyslexia, might give that learner the advantage to be able to promote their own skills, knowledge, and behaviours in a way that is appropriate without the need to plagiarize. And those are the key issues, and so how we look at managing those learners on that journey. We're here to support you as a centre, but we're also here to look at the best interests of the learner to ensure that they have a legal entitlement to be certificated at the end of that programme of learning. So that's it for me, and thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm going to be on the panel later, so feel free to ask away.
Many thanks, John. Obviously, a lot of things that can be done to prevent, and we'll maybe pick up some of those as we go through. So, but thanks to you and indeed to Mike for setting the scene. And please, folk, don't forget to put any questions for Mike or John into the Q&A or the chat function as we've been talking, and we'll pick them up as we go in. We're now going to go into a bit of a panel discussion, and I want to bring in 3 additional experts in the shape of Don Bedell, who's an EQA with SFJ Awards, Caroline Stanley and Kate Dennis, who both lead IQAs with North Yorkshire Police. If you want to turn your cameras back on then, folks, we are delighted to have you all here with us today, sharing your expertise and your practical tips. And I've got a few questions that came up when we were all talking about planning this. So to get us going, I'm going to kick off just with a few of those, and then we'll see what else we get from our audience today and see where that takes us. So just I thought really for Mike, you've obviously touched on quite a lot of aspects about culture, about commitment, values and trust, and the importance of setting the right scene, as it were, for learning to be something that is an individual and a leadership or responsibility. What's the key ingredient in that list? Because you had quite a number of things there. What's the top one, do you think?
The top ingredient, without which none of this can work, is leadership. Mm-hmm. This is fundamentally a leadership challenge, a leadership responsibility. Leaders set the tone for an organization, they set the direction, and they set the climate. Mm-hmm. So in terms of setting expectations around professional responsibility to learn, and then setting the facilities in place to give people the opportunity to live up to those expectations and to fulfill those expectations, is absolutely a leadership responsibility. In some ways, this discussion we're having today, it's great. I feel that we probably have a lot of converted people in the audience listening to this and wanting to sign up to this. And I look forward to the opportunity to have a similar discussion with the most senior people in organizations, because I have spoken to many of them, and sometimes they're the ones in need of understanding this requirement more than others.
Thank you. That's a very good point, and obviously that's something we'll be able to set up, is some further conversations. But actually, something that then sort of resonates with me a bit from that, and maybe it's something I don't know, Dawn or perhaps Caroline or Kate would just like to pick up, which is, leaders themselves are learners and want to and need to be learners if we're going to develop the kind of culture that you're talking about. But from your experiences, do professional learners take assessment in their stride completely, Dawn, or is it something of an ordeal for them too?
I think it depends on what kind of sector people work from, and looking at the list of potential people that are on the webinar today and through the chat function, we've got colleagues from the fire service, from border force, we've got private training providers, we've got people from the security industry, we've got prison services represented. So there's a whole kind of plethora of different organisations, and I think depending on the culture of the organisation will depend on where assessment sits. So certainly in the police sector, fire service and prison service, of which I have links with as an EQA, I know that assessment is pretty much a mandatory way of life, in that it is, if you want to be promoted, if you want to be developed, if you want to make lateral moves, there is some form of accreditation process. So I think for those types of sectors, people, they accept that when they go to those moves, that's part of the process. However, do they take it in their stride? Some do. Some people, warm to it very easily and are very familiar. And if they've done previous programs where they've done accreditation, absolutely. But there are a lot of people that they've never encountered this type of learning. They may have left school without very few qualifications. They may not have done an academic route of learning. So when we start to put a portfolio in front of them where they have to provide evidence, yeah, it's like a bit like a rabbit in headlights. And interestingly, in as a side to my role in SFJ Awards, I also work in the police service as an assessor and an IQA. And this morning have literally been doing initial meetings with candidates, talking through the assessment process. And, you know, everything that John and Mike have said around the pressures around the organisations we work in, it just creates it as it's almost like an extra thing for them to be doing, where in actual fact, what we need to be encouraging them is to say, all we want you to do is to go and do your day job. Yeah, that's why you've got people like assessors, IQAs and the assessment teams around you to help you support what paperwork you need to fill in and what portfolios you need to tick, etc. What we want for our learners is that we just want them to do their day job. We want them to be working as, you know, in the fire service, prison service, police service, etc., doing their job. And as assessors, we help them unpick their day job to work out what the best evidence is. So by doing that, we try and relieve some of that pressure, that concern, that worry. We take it off their shoulders. And I know some organisations will be learner-led, some will be assessor-led, and there's a debate which we won't even get to today, which is the right or wrong, because it's what's right for the organisation, what's right for the culture. So I think in whatever role people are in that assessment role, they just need to make sure, as echo what Mike said, is that the leaders in the organisation understand the importance of assessment and where it sits, and then making sure that they have the right people in place to provide that support and guidance. And by doing that, hopefully our learners, our candidates, don't see it as I've got another thing to do on top of my incredibly busy job. They see it as part of their day job rather than something extra.
Thanks very much, Dawn. Caroline, I wonder if I could come to you, just because we've talked about all the way through so far about the importance of being supportive. So how do you go about making sure you have adequate opportunities in place for learners just to raise the alarm if they're struggling?
I think it's important, as Mike mentioned at the beginning, right from the very outset, to have those honest conversations with the learners. So that could be part of the formal induction process that we do, but also to give them that go-to person. So although I take on a lead IQA role or an IQA role sometimes with certain learners, I am out of the line management structure. So I am seen as somebody, or Kate and I are both seen as somebody that they can come to. And we get a lot of telephone calls and contact and emails from people who just need to be able to just talk through their concerns. And it is around, I don't feel as if I'm very academic, I don't think I can do this. And I think by having those open discussions, we can put together an individual plan for each of the learners as to what is the best way to approach their evidence. Thinking as well about reasonable adjustments. So quite often within a very practical type job like policing, people have found some excellent coping mechanisms, but actually have underlying neurodiversity issues. So sometimes in that plagiarism discussion and that induction discussion, we sometimes pick up, you know what, there are other things that we can do, reasonable adjustments we can make to support them. But I think it's that openness from the beginning, really.
And that's obviously an important role for the learning teams, because as you say, they're one removed, aren't they, from the line management structure. But also, I suppose, part of what we're hoping to get to, or would like to see happening, is within a culture of commitment to ongoing learning, that line managers themselves, whatever rank they're able to provide that level of support, and people don't feel overly challenged to get there. With one question that we've had come in, which is very practical, but I think it's an important one, and it might be something, I don't know, maybe either Kate or John might want to pick up, and that's a question that's coming from Bill, who says, I'm interested to learn the panel's opinion on how much referencing is considered appropriate within an assignment. I've seen some centres using a range of percentages, saying they allow 20% copy and paste as long as it's referenced. Do you have any sense of that? Do you have any rules, Kate, that you particularly follow in your centre?
We don't put rules on referencing as such, like percentage rules, but we would expect that any sources that are used are referenced, especially from a knowledge point of view. So if someone submits a knowledge piece of evidence, we would like to see every reference to where they've got their source information from. But also, we would like to see at least a paragraph underneath as to what they've gained from that information, how that fits in with their role, what they understand from it. So we'd like to see the reference, the body of the text, and then a bit from them to put it into context as to what that means for them and how they understand it. So we don't have rules as such as to how much or how little, but we want it all referenced, and it has to be referenced, but they also need to show their own understanding as well.
Yeah, because it's them you're assessing, not the quality of the sources they're using. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and from my perspective, the referencing is the essential part, because and that synthesis, the understanding, the application of, because for me awarding that certificate, I need to be assured that the candidate, the learner, has that proficiency and the authenticity is there that demonstrates their competence, so or knowledge that they're referring to. So that the referencing is essential.
Thanks for that, John. So just perhaps sticking with you for a minute, John. Obviously, SFJ Awards has a duty to report any incidents that constitute malpractice or maladministration. Given that, can you just share with everybody who's listening in today what actually happens if a centre discloses a suspected plagiarism to you, or it's picked up by one of your team or an EQA like Dawn? What happens? What takes place?
Well, the importance part around this in reality is the mitigations and the safeguards that have been engineered into the design of qualifications in the first instance to try and prevent the potential. However, we understand that human error can happen, and all these aspects that will lead to that investigation as part of. So it might, as you mentioned there, Dawn might identify as part of her role in the EQAing. She sampled it. If you've seen it and read it before, you pretty much know that it's probably been used before, and so it then follows that investigation process. We have to take all reasonable steps to ensure that a learner has a legal entitlement to a certificate. So we then go through the investigation process to understand that, and ultimately it may result in a certificate being revoked because of a false claim or due to the malpractice or maladministration. So we have to go through step by step by step, and there is no common kind of answer to it. It's on a case-by-case basis that we have to look at it, the intent and how it then proceeds and progresses. But as Mike said earlier, it can have significant consequences on people's careers.
Absolutely. Well, as Mike said, the honesty is non-negotiable, and if something has been an error that calls into question somebody's honesty, there's a problem for everybody concerned, and we need to address that. Caroline, just I thought for you, really, we've heard about what happens there from SFJ Awards. What does SFJ Awards do? But what happens if there's the implications for learners from your experience of a suspicion of plagiarism or of an investigation being conducted?
I mean, I think the first thing to mention is the word investigation in policing probably has quite different connotations. So although I think from the SFJ point of view, it would be termed as an investigation, we would term it as a quality audit. Yeah. So I think the important things really are to not assume anything and actually be able to go through, possibly consult with another IQA, a colleague, to see if you can find out what the actual extent of any plagiarism is. And then when you go and speak to the learner, and you need to do this fairly quickly, I wouldn't sort of hold back on doing this, speak to the learner and find out what is happening from their point of view, because it could just be a simple mistake. And the implications of that, even in investigation, in terms of honesty and integrity in policing, can really affect people. It makes them very anxious. We have to always report everything to our professional standards department. So the ramifications are massive, and we need to consider the welfare of that individual, because if they have just made a mistake, then we need to deal with it quickly, make sure everybody is happy that we've documented all of that, so that we can then move on and let them know what they need to do for the future.
Thank you. There's a comment here from Louise who's saying that often plagiarism can come from the learner not understanding what's actually been asked by the question, maybe finding it ambiguous or just not being well enough structured. So what does that imply for the kind of support processes that you need to put in place for learners as they come up to the point of assessment? I don't know if somebody wants to pick that up. Dawn, what about you?
Yeah, I think everything that Caroline has said is, it's very much about, as soon as there is any reason to believe that there is something not quite right with that assessment, wherever it's picked up, is for it to be managed very quickly, very promptly, and thinking about, as you say, the implications to the people involved. And I think, Louise's comment there about lack of understanding is where your assessor comes in and is making sure that assessment plans that are put in place, whether or not you have that verbal conversation, it's followed up by a written assessment plan. I know some centres use kind of assessment templates. I do, because I'm covering the same things, therefore you have a kind of bit of a template. It's just to make sure that your learner, your candidate, actually appreciates what they need to do, how they can approach it. Do they need to do a written assignment? Can they do it through a professional discussion? What are the options for the evidence that they can produce? Is it product, etc.? And I think sometimes it's also about us as awarding organisations trying to help the centres standardise what those criteria actually mean. I'm looking at Kate and Caroline. We've all worked in the policing sector for quite some time and have worked with a whole range of different assessment criteria, and some of them are very, very obvious. And some of them, as an assessor with 25 years experience behind me, I look at them and I still think, what does that actually mean? What does that require my candidate to do? So I think the other side to it is where centres can support this whole process is about supporting their assessors in standardisation and helping everyone understand what do these criteria actually mean, but also being mindful that sometimes whatever role somebody's in, the evidence is not going to look the same. You sometimes have to be a bit of lateral thinking. You have to be thinking about what role is that person in, what is their abilities. We do have people in the police service who are permanently operationally restricted. However, they can still go through a promotion process. So we have to kind of look at, different individual needs. So I think it's about having that conversation. And I think just picking up on what Ian said there as well about people fueled by panic. They know they're doing it. And they don't feel there's another option. It's again, I think what Caroline was saying there is, if you've got clear support structures in place and people know, candidates, assessors know who they can go and talk to if they've got a concern or a problem or a worry. We need people to be honest with us in centres. I know the way I work with my candidates, and I say, I know what the situation is today, but if something changes in 6 months' time and something's going on, I don't need to know all the nitty gritty, but just come and tell me so I'm aware of the pressures you're under and we can take that into account. So I think it's lots of different things I've said there, but that support and direction comes from so many different directions.
Sure, absolutely. And I notice, Mike, that you're deliberately trying to break this webinar by asking the audience questions rather than answering them. But it's a very good question, really, because what you've said is, well, what is it that people who here want or need from their leaders in order to get this culture right and to get the system flowing? And I don't know if I'm going to throw it right back at you and say, if you get any examples or thoughts of where you've seen it done really well.
I mean, I think it goes back to the point that clearly people on this call are working really hard in this field. And I think it's legitimate for you to set requirements of the people who lead the organisation as to how you could do your job better, how you could achieve the things that you need to achieve. And I think leaders need to have that challenge and need to have that questioning, and you need to try and find routes to put that in. You know, if you want to get you very often people who are closest to the problems will also be closest to the solutions.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about practitioners, whether it's in this field or whether it's operationally, whether it's in anything, having line of communication with their leaders to say, actually, in order for us to get the best out of everybody who's working for us, I think a good idea might be to do X, Y, or Z. And I'm not the person to know what X, Y, or Z is. I'm probably far removed from that. But my educated guess is that people on this webinar will absolutely know what things could make this much more effective.
Sure.
In terms of achieving the outcomes that we're looking to, i.e. preventing people from getting to the position of falling into the trap of plagiarism.
No, I think so. And I mean, I'm kind of obviously teasing you, but I think we would welcome at SFJ Awards hearing from people on the call about that, because obviously we can feed that into you, Mike, but we can also look to provide some of that sharing of that practice and those ideas as well as we go forward with these sessions. I've got another couple of questions. I think, Dawn, you're indicating you're going to pick up with Jonathan Ainsley subsequently, reframing questions and reframing answers. But I've also had another comment just about this business of, if questions are ambiguous, yes, the assessor has a role to play. But John Clark, what is the role here of the awarding organisation? Because I know that you do look at questions that are used and check whether they're effective or otherwise. Is there something that we should be doing there?
Yeah, it's all in the design. It's ensuring the assessment is fit for purpose in the first instance, and manufacturing out the potential for any confusion. But as one of the key things is prevention is a lot better than the cure. So if we can get this cut through at the beginning in the planning, in terms of how we design it, and having that time with the candidate, the learner, and provide them with guidance and support, it stops the delay at the back end when things start to become more pressurized and they start to make mistakes. And that then leads to the validity of that assessment, which the assessor is looking at, to ensure that they have demonstrated the knowledge that's coming through. So it's planning with the learner, it's the prevention to get the candidate prepared for that assessment.
Thank you. And do you receive then, or do you want, as part of this discussion, to ask if they're not doing it, if centres are working with learners and finding that's becoming a problem, there's an issue with a particular question that they, you hear, this is the third person I've heard say, I'm not quite sure what to get at.
Yeah,
we need to know, don't we? Yeah, absolutely.
That's part of our continuing improvement. And I think Jane has just put up a comment on the chat saying we feedback to us as the awarding organisation is very useful and we welcome it. We want to make we get it right first time. If it is slightly ambiguous and uncertain for a learner, it might be it's affecting more than one in different centres. So even the smallest one, we'd like to know. We can then do something about that.
Excellent, thank you. And I've had another suggestion here that's been posed by Paul Wilkinson from Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, and he's saying that we assign an assessor to an individual when they're completing their assignments to give that personal link, create some continuity. So it's not faceless email. They've got somebody they know they can talk to, and that seems to work well. And I think from I can see the nods from colleagues around the panel that is a kind of a good practice and something actually to continue to roll out. One other thought, John, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about some of the preventative measures, you mentioned the use of software.
Yes.
And also policies. And I suppose a question I've got, I'm curious to know to what extent, and maybe either Kate or Caroline, as centres in your centre, do you have specific policies about plagiarism or policies that cover plagiarism in some way? How does that tend to get dealt with?
We have a policy in North Yorkshire Police, which we have used the Skills for Justice policy and worked alongside professional standards to make sure the two policies obviously satisfy what Skills for Justice Awards expect from us,
Yeah.
but also satisfy from a North Yorkshire Police point of view. So we have our malpractice maladministration policy, which we've merged together, which clearly sets out the steps of how we would deal with any suspected plagiarism and what the clear steps are thereafter. And we find it very important that we stick to that policy, because obviously it can have legal implications, it can have job loss implications, and challenges can come from it as well. So we make sure that when we when we quality audit any suspected plagiarism, that we do so to the letter of our policy, so there can't be any challenges come back in the future.
Yeah, and obviously everybody involved, from the learner to the assessor, etc., they're all cited and working to the same policy. So you've got that consistent, objective approach, which is so important to building that trust back into the system, that it's going to be fair and it's going to be appropriate. I'm going to pop another quick poll up, because you've mentioned there that we have a draft plagiarism policy that SFJ Awards have generated, and really just a question: is that something, folks, you'd welcome? Obviously it can be customizable, as Kate has said, and align it with the professional standards team expectations there, so you can take it and adjust it. But is that something that would be valuable, or we'd certainly be interested to know? And while you're answering that, what I would like to do is to just flag up to our panel members that in a moment, what I might do is put you on the spot and ask you for a top tip on supporting the professional as learner and preventing the pitfalls of plagiarism. So you might want to be thinking about what you're going to come up with there, because we'll come to you in just a moment or two on that. So while the poll result is being monitored, and 100% yes, well, I think there's no doubt then, is there? Okay, so folks, we will make that happen. That's a promise. You've heard it here. We will absolutely make sure that we get something shared with everybody here. And it will be customizable. The whole point is it has to work for you. So it'll cover off what our requirements are within the context of being an awarding organisation, but it's something you can work on. Fantastic. So we will do that. And now I am going to go around the table, and I'm going to ask Caroline first. Caroline, your one top tip, what would you say to everybody?
I would say my top tip is don't ignore it. Deal with it quickly, but work with your awarding organisation. So contact Skills for Justice Awards, contact your local teams within your own organisation, and approach it getting everybody involved. Don't think you have to deal with it on your own.
Lovely, thank you very much. So no lone players there. Kate, do you want to add to that, or do you have another top tip?
I totally agree with Caroline. I was going to say, make the learner aware very early on what plagiarism is. So we do that as part of our formal induction. We share our malpractice maladministration policy, so everybody is aware of it. So prevention's always better than the cure, which I think has been said before on here. So if they don't know what's right and wrong, they won't be able to work within them boundaries. So make them aware as soon as possible.
Great, super, thank you. Dawn, from your helicopter perspective, what would be your one top tip?
Yeah, I think, you know what, it's picking up what Caroline and Kate said. I think all the way through we need to promote honesty, which is something that Mike, you know, has talked about earlier in this. And it is about the learners being honest, the assessors being honest, but making sure that as centres you've got those support processes in place. So as and when these situations do arise, you can deal with them quickly and promptly. And I think with everything, and there's various people in the chat function saying about having policies, declarations, etc., etc. Yeah, absolutely. Making sure that you explain what plagiarism is, include it in your induction, make sure your policies are available to your learners, not just your assessors, and have that open culture that if someone's worried about something, they've got a question, that there's nothing wrong in asking that and bringing those issues forward. Because if people do, we can help them. You know, centres can help them, SFJ Awards can help them.
Yeah. So don't keep shy, come talking. John, very, very quickly, and then Mike, I'm going to come to you, but we've got 1 minute to go. So briefly, your top tip, John.
Information, advice and guidance to the learner. Start from the beginning, set them up to go.
Set them up to succeed. Good one. Mike, you started us off. Give us your last word. You're on mute.
The one person to be on mute. To support the professional as learner from a leadership perspective, be very open about yourself as a learner and role model it. Role model the behaviours.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much indeed. So thank you to our panel. Fantastic contributions from each and every one of you. Really glad that you were able to join us. I hope everybody listening in has enjoyed the webinar, found it useful. We'll get that plagiarism policy out to you all. Don't forget, you will be able to share this. You will get the slides. You will get the a notification of the recording on screen. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Have a good day. Bye for now.